Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing the April reading wrap-up. So like I said in the last video, I'm going to start incorporating my Storygraph monthly wrap-up into these videos because they're not getting any shorter, so we might as well just do everything. Yeah, if you don't use Storygraph, you should. This is a free feature that they give to everyone at the end of the month. And let's take a look. So I read 22 books in April. That's one less than March, but we take those. I read 9,479 pages, so I actually read more pages even though I read one less book. The first book I read was Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler. The middle book that I read was Among the Bros by Max Marshall, and the last book I read in the month was Guards by Terry Pratchett. The average book length was 372 pages. Average time to finish, 2 days. All pretty standard. I read 91% fiction and 9% nonfiction. We got that nonfiction percentage up, okay, almost to 10%. But I read the most fantasy books, followed very far behind by LGBTQIA, horror, science fiction, and young adult. I read 86% print and 14% digital. Okay, and now we're gonna go through all the books that I read this month. Okay, so the first book I read in the month of April was Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler. This is a book set in the 90s that follows this person, Paul, who is a shapeshifter. He uses he pronouns for himself even when he's shapeshifted into a girl, so that's what I'm going to use as well. Paul can shapeshift from male to female and in between, and it's like a slice of life coming of age story about Paul and how he moves from this small college in Ohio or something to falling in love with someone and being heartbroken over them, to moving to LA and finding a new life for himself there. It is very pop culture heavy, very 90s pop culture heavy, and that's just not my time period. I don't know a lot about the 90s. I was born in 2002, so I just don't know a lot about that culture, so a lot of the references went over my head. And again, this is a very referential story, and it's very stream of consciousness, slice of lifey, so I kind of struggled with this one. I mean, I really enjoyed it as a trans allegory, which is clearly what it is, especially particularly a trans woman allegory. I thought it was really interesting taken from that lens, but as a narrative, I wanted a little bit more from it. One of the most interesting things that happens, one of the only through lines of this story, is that Paul is searching for other people like him, other people who can shapeshift, and he finds someone. He sees them at the very beginning of the story, but then doesn't actually come into contact with them. Their name's Robin, until much later when he has moved to San Francisco or LA. I don't remember which one it is, sorry guys, at the very end of the book. And by the end of the book, we still don't even know if Robin and Paul are going to be friends, or if they're going to date, or even if they're just not gonna have anything to do with each other. And I thought that was kind of, I will take a not easily definable, complex, nuanced relationship any day of the week, but it just felt like we hadn't even begun to explore any of those options before the story was over. So I liked this, but I wouldn't necessarily say I loved it, but I think, again, it would work much better for people who do really know a lot about 90s culture, especially music culture, and I just don't, so that's okay. I used this for the Female Gaze SFF Summer Reading Challenge for the Square trans author. Okay, then the second book I read was Winter Be My Shield by Jo Spurrier. This is a kind of high fantasy novel set in this world where there are these tribes kind of trapped in between two invading cultures, and one of them has been taken over by this evil king, and the rightful king and his brother have fled to the tribes to kind of try to hunker down until they can regain the throne. And the younger brother, Isidro, is kidnapped by the king and tortured by him for ages, and eventually rescued, but is still clearly deeply impacted by what he went through at the hands of the torturer, and at the hands of the torturer's apprentice, Rastin, and the other girl that they have working for them, Sierra. So Rastin and Sierra, despite being kind of torturer's apprentices, have also been through a lot at the hands of this torturer. They've been abused basically their whole lives, Sierra especially, because she is not really seen as a apprentice, she's seen as a power source. She is one of the few people in this land who are gifted with magic, but magic is viewed as kind of a curse in this world. She has very destructive powers, and they basically leech off of her powers in order to make their own more powerful. And so at the start of the story, Sierra has successfully escaped from Rastin and their master, and she joins up with Isidro and the rebels. And at first she's kind of trying to keep her identity a secret. She doesn't want them to know she helped torture their brother. And it's all about how she gets kind of drawn up into their cause and falls for Isidro, all while Rastin is kind of like trying to chase her down and kind of help her give in and learn more about her power, all while they try to evade not only the king who is trying to capture them, but also the invading Akarian Empire, who are basically trying to enslave everyone in this land. So I thought it was a great story about like trying to either fight off two cultures or choose the lesser of two evils. I liked that magic was like a curse in this world, but that there were different attitudes towards magic with different cultures, which helped it feel a lot more real and lived in. I loved that the tribes were polyamorous, although that doesn't really come into play in this book. We don't actually really see that, we're just told that. And I was very interested by the dynamic between Rastin, Sierra, and Isidro, like this kind of three-way dynamic. You know me, you know I love a good throuple. This three-way dynamic where all of them have like hurt each other. Well, Isidro kind of did nothing wrong, but where they have hurt each other deeply, but like also kind of they're the only ones who know what it was like to be in that situation, and they all have very different goals and different methods of achieving those goals. So there's all this friction between them, but also kind of care for each other that I really enjoyed. However, a couple things. I didn't really love the romance between Sierra and Isidro. At first I liked it as this kind of like trauma bond, like we've both been through the same thing, we know. I know that's not the correct use of trauma bond, by the way, sorry, I'm not correcting it. They both have been through a really hard circumstance. They kind of are the only people besides Rastin who know what it was like. They kind of bond over that and they take comfort in each other, but like it goes so quickly from being like, don't be ridiculous, we're not in love, we've only known each other a week, to we're totally in love and I would literally die without him, he's the only thing keeping me alive. That was frustrating to me and not entirely believable, especially because by the end of this story, they've spent more time apart, kidnapped in various configurations than they have together. So I wasn't totally bought into that, and I know some people don't like the relationship between Isidro and Sierra because they like ship Sierra and Rastin. That's not exactly where I'm coming from. I did think the dynamic between Sierra and Rastin was more interesting, but I didn't necessarily see it romantic. Well, I mean, I can see it becoming romantic, but it wasn't like, that's not the reason why I didn't like Sierra and Isidro, because I was just like, she should get with this other guy instead. And I have to speak my truth, I found it really cringy whenever Rastin called her Little Crow. I know people are gonna find that like sexy and romantic. I just cringed, I'm sorry, I can't take it. Maybe that's just because I go by crow, so I'm like, don't call me that, do not call me that. But another thing that kind of stops me from really wanting to continue on with this series is the amount of torture and suffering. And I didn't think, you know, Robin Hobb had blurbed this book on the cover. You know you're about to suffer a lot when you read that. And I didn't think it was overkill in this book. I found that the core of the story is really about trauma and trauma recovery, and so that like the on-page torture and violence and sexual violence never felt like it went too far. It felt like it went just far enough so that we could have that discussion. But at the end of this book, I did just kind of feel exhausted by the amount of things that the characters had gone through and the amount of things that I had had to witness. And the end of the book just kind of promises to only ramp up in book 2. Especially in terms of sexual violence, and I'm just not in the mood for that right now. And my library doesn't even have the second and third books in the series, it only had the first, so I'm not sure when I will continue with this series. I did like it and I would recommend this first book, but only if you, like me, are a Robin Hobb fan, you like to see your characters suffer, you don't mind reading about bad things happening to characters you like. So there's that. I also read Voices and Powers by Ursula K. Le Guin. These are the second and third book in the Annals of the Western Shore trilogy. I am a big Le Guin fan, but I had like just never heard of this series before, and I finally read it and I ended up really enjoying it. Hot take, I think it is a better / more cohesive series than Earthsea, and I love Earthsea, and I would say, you know, Tombs of Adawan and Tehanu are like 2 of my favorite books of all time, but as a series it has some really high highs and really low lows, and it is a series that is like ideologically at war with itself. That's the whole reason why she went back to it like 20 years later. I don't know if you can hear that dog barking, I'm just gonna continue because it's not stopping. It's a series that is ideologically at war with itself, And this series is very ideologically coherent and very coherent as a series about what its themes and goals are and what it is trying to do, and I really enjoyed that. I really loved Voices. It's the story of this girl Memmer who is living in this city that is under siege, and how she kind of comes of age in that environment, and how they eventually free the city, and the kind of relationship she forms with the characters from the first two books who are now like grown up, older. And then the third book, Powers, is also, I really enjoyed a lot. It's about this like house slave Gav who runs away from his masters after they do something horrible, and it's deeply about loyalty and how you cannot have loyalty and justice without having equality, and how even if, you know, you are a nice slave owner, you're still a slave owner, and that's still morally wrong, and slavery is still like an evil institution. And it's deeply about loyalty and putting your loyalty in the wrong people. And at the end of the story, he finds Gry and Oric and Memmer and is kind of like, finally, I found someone I can trust. My problem with Powers, I really love Powers, but my problem with it is that it strangely feels like half a narrative. Like, we as the audience know, because we've read the other books in the series, that when he gets to Gry and Oric and Memmer, that he has found people that he can trust and like be loyal to, and who deserve his loyalty, but he doesn't know that yet. His life has really only just started, and we don't get to see any of it, and there's still do feel to be like some lingering threads around the other slaves that he left behind, and like, yeah. And also, he starts the narrative like, we know from the beginning that this is like him in the future recollecting and like writing down and reflecting on his story, writing it for someone, and he even at certain points directly addresses the narrative to his wife. And my problem with this is that we never catch up to the point in which he meets his wife or the point in which he decides to write down his story, and so that to me felt a little weird. And like, I thought for a second that his wife was going to be Memmer, because Le Guin loves to do that shit. She loves to have the protagonists of two separate books get together, and he does describe her hair when they meet as radiant, but other than that, no. You'd think he would mention that if he was writing a narrative to his wife and he got to the point where he met his wife, be like, and that's when I met you, but he doesn't. So that was just something that felt, again, like kind of a half a narrative, like a drop plot point. And I really do think that she probably was going to come back to this series at some point, and then just never did, because it looks like Powers, which was published in 2007, was one of the last like original fantasy works she wrote before she passed in 2018. Everything after this looks to be poetry and short stories and like republications, collections of previous work. So that's kind of a shame, but I still do really recommend this series and think it is really great. Again, really cohesive, and it honestly deals with a lot of themes that she dealt with really early on in her career, but in a more complex, nuanced, and interesting way, despite the fact that those books were adult sci-fi and fantasy, and this is a YA series. So that just shows, you know, how much she grew over the course of her writing career, and I really do recommend. And then I read Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. This was, oh, and I forgot to mention that Winter Be My Shield was for the sub-rec bingo square, challenge square, because I did get recommended it on the subreddit, or on a subreddit, I don't remember which one. And then Voices I used for poetry, because Gry and Oric come to the city and they recite a lot of poetry, and that ends up being a big catalyst for revolution. And then Powers I used for, what did I use that for? I think I just used it for my free square. Okay. And then Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. This was for my author discovery square, because I've never read from this author before. I have heard her other work, Where the Salt Grows Heavy or something, be very highly praised. And so I wanted to check out this one, and this one my library had right away. So I was sadly not super impressed by this book. I like the concept. I like the concept of like a bunch of friends who secretly hate each other going to this haunted house and like basically getting eaten alive by the house. But the execution was just not super there for me. It felt like the like secret beef that the friends had that was supposed to tear them apart was also pointless. Like I just never really believed that they liked each other in the first place, or even that they disliked each other. Like they just felt like, I was like, why would they care about this? Why would this guy care that his fiance had sex with one of their friends years ago one time? And why would Kat, the main character, care about that and think it was this horrible thing for her to do when she doesn't care about either of those people in the first place? Like, it was just beyond me. It didn't add to like the juice, the tension of the work for me, because you just never believe that they were friends in the first place. I also just didn't really like the writing style of this. It's very flowery, very purple, you know me, known purple prose hater, like I just couldn't do it. And then also, This is a very genre-aware story. It is very much playing with the idea that white guys survive horror stories and anyone who's a minority in any way dies. It's brought up explicitly in the story multiple times that that is how things usually go, and surprise, that's not how things go in here. And I don't know, I feel like you can have that genre awareness in a comedic horror, but in a book like this that is trying so hard to be very mysterious and scary, it just didn't really land for me. This has really, really low ratings on Storygraph. I wouldn't say I hated it that much. I just didn't think it was super impressive, but like I would still be willing to pick up something else from Cassandra Claus, so take that as you will. And then I read Jade City by Fonda Lee. This is the first book in the Greenbone saga, which is this very, very beloved fantasy story. I'm not gonna lie, I put off reading this for so long. One, because it's very popular, and I'm a contrarian, I don't like to like popular things. And two, I thought it was medieval. I don't know why, that's on me. Basically, it's a mafia movie. It's a mafia movie, but they have magic. And that's fun. That's fun. I love a good mafia movie. I love Peaky Blinders. I haven't seen past season 1, but I love a good mafia movie. And Fonda Lee really taps in to what makes mafia movies so fun. The idea of seeing these complex, sometimes likable and sometimes not, characters do smart yet bad things to protect their family is fun. Like, it's fun to see people do crazy shit for their family sometimes. So I did enjoy this book. The prose is very contemporary and very quick and keeps you moving very quickly. However, there were some weird stylistic and phrasing choices here to me. I thought Woon was non-binary for like 4 pages when he was first introduced, because the sentence in which he's introduced has 2 subjects. It has Woon and Woon's minions. And the way that the sentence is constructed, it looks like the pronoun them is referring to Woon when it's really referring to his minions. And like, I should have caught on to that, right? But the way it was phrased looked so much like it was using they, them for Woon. And there had been gay characters introduced earlier on in the story. So I was like, oh, maybe they are non-binary. And then somehow Fonda Lee accidentally manages to dodge using pronouns or gender terms for Woon for like 4 pages. So I was totally convinced in that time that he was non-binary and used they, them pronouns. And then all of a sudden, it's like Woon said, raising his eyebrows. And I was like, okay. And then also Fonda Lee will do this thing where when there's a big info dump that needs to be done, she will go from kind of really narrow third person past tense narration to really omniscient broad third person present tense narration. And every time it brought me out of the story and felt unnecessary and was kind of just a sign that I could start skipping, because the characters already do a lot of info dumping in their own internal monologues, like in their own perspectives. So I just it wasn't consistent in what was big enough or complex enough that she needed to go into present tense to info dump about, and what wasn't. It was not internally consistent. So that was kind of a pet peeve for me as well. But I also didn't like that Andon was like basically in a waiting room for this entire book. But I did like the ending, and I did like it enough to continue on with the second book in this series, which we'll talk about later, because I don't want to talk about these books together because they're big, they're chunky. So I used Jade City for the green cover square on the bingo. Then I read A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. I have such a hit or miss relationship with T. Kingfisher. The first thing I read from her was Clockwork Boys, which I don't know why. I thought that book was gay. I don't know why. It is not. And it's only half a story, and I was so taken aback by my mismatched expectations that I really did not like that book. I think if I read it without any expectations, I would think it was just fine. I would probably continue on with it, but just because of how surprised I was at that fact that I was totally convinced it was gay, then it ended up not being gay, I was like, what the hell? And so I thought it was just fine. And then I read Thorn Hedge and really liked that short story. And then I read A House with Good Bones and really did not like it. I really didn't like this one either. I think this is probably my least favorite of the T. Kingfishers I've read, and it's really like a St. Gibson, V.E. Schwab situation for me. Maybe I just hate authors that go by their first initial, I don't know why, where I really love the concept, but I didn't love the execution. I love the concept of telling this like Southern Gothic horror story, but from the perspective of like, you know, a fat gay scientist or something, and set in a suburban cookie cutter house instead of like a Victorian mansion or plantation house. So I loved that concept, and I loved, you know, I love a good beating parental trauma, generational trauma, parental abuse type theme, but the way that it was done here just didn't get me, and I'll explain further, but it's going to be a little bit spoilery, so bear with me. First of all, I really just did not like the narrator or the writing style of this book. It's just a bit too quirky millennial for me. I never like a style like this where the narrator is just so quirky and so chatty and like jokey and is like very aware that they're talking to an audience and feels like they're playing up their reactions and their internal monologue for an audience. I just hate that. I can't stand it. And again, because I'm not of that generation, like I think a lot of the humor fell flat for me. T. Kingfisher does my pet peeve, which is when you repeat a sentence on a new line in italics to emphasize it and to add like to artificially induce tension. I hate that. I don't know why. It just, for me, it's like if the sentence was that serious in the first place, you should have just italicized it in the first place, okay? So there's that. I didn't love the writing style. Also, this main character has a serious case of couldn't believe they were in a horror novel, a supernatural horror novel, for way too long. Like, I get it. She's a scientist. This is a genre convention. The main character has to deny that anything supernatural is happening until it seems like way too late in the story. But it was way too far here. Like, you're digging up jars of teeth in your garden that no one has buried there, and you're still saying that there's nothing supernatural going on. Like, it's just, I'm sorry, you gotta wake up at that point. And then I thought, related to that kind of, I thought the pacing was really janky in this one. Like, for 80% of the story, the main character is refusing to believe anything is going on and is just like drinking boxed wine and watching crime shows with her mom, which is great. But I didn't feel a true sense of rising tension. Like, some weird stuff would happen and then the protagonist would again just go right back to like chilling with her mom and refusing to believe that anything was going on, which was frustrating. And then all of a sudden, in like the last 20% of the novel, everything happens and it feels very rushed. And to further get into my problems with that ending and the themes, I'm gonna be spoilery. So the theme of this book is obviously like parental abuse and beating that cycle of abuse, but then the person who actually banishes Grandmay's ghost is Gail, their neighbor. Instead of like having the narrator, I don't remember her name, sorry, and her mom defeat the grandmother's ghost through like the power of love, or like deciding that they don't care about what she thinks anymore or something like that. So it just felt thematically inconsistent. And then also when they fall into the hole in the ground and the underground children start to come from them, the only thing that saves them is the rose magic that Grandmay like basically forced the narrator to learn when she, you know, hurt her and fed the roses her blood. That is what ends up saving them, because the roses, you know her blood and they come to life and they save them. So like, what does that say about abuse and about the way we treat our children? Like, that as long as we, you know, we can treat them bad as long as it's for a good reason and it's ultimately justifying them. Like, I don't think that's what T. Kingfisher is trying to say, by the way. I don't think that's what she's trying to say, but like, the undertones of that are weird, right? The fact that ultimately the way that Grandma treated her did end up being helpful and useful, and like, there's just not enough done with that because it's at, again, the very like last page of the story. And the revelation that the main character is probably a witch too, like, again, it just happened so late and we have no time to actually explore it and do anything interesting with the idea that like this scientist, this very strict logical person, now knows she has magic. It really feels like maybe she wanted to come back to this, or, you know, write more books in a series like this, but it's a standalone, so I don't know. So yeah, I didn't really like this one. I'm still on the hunt for my perfect T. Kingfisher book. I really did like Thornhedge, and I'm probably gonna try her like romantasy series, Swordheart, and the Paladin series, Saints of Steel I think it's called, because I have liked her fantasy more than I've liked her horror so far, so we shall see. And I use this for the 30+ MC bingo card. I think the main character is 32. And then I read The Privilege of the Sword by Ellen Kushner. This is the sequel to Swords Point, which I read last month and really, really loved. And this one I liked as well, although I didn't love it quite as much. It's a bit more YA feeling because it's like the coming of age story of a teenage girl who is the niece of Alec the Mad Duke from the first book. And at the beginning of the story, her family are like estranged from Alec's branch and are running out of money. They've been in this protracted legal battle with him for ages, and he is basically like, if you send me your daughter and let her live with me and do whatever I ask her to do for like 6 months, I will completely give you back all the money or whatever. And so they're like, well, you know, this is basically the same as selling her into marriage, so whatever. And they send Catherine off, and surprise, surprise, he wants her to dress like a boy and learn how to sword fight. And while she's there, we see that Alec and Richard have become mysteriously estranged. They don't live together anymore. They don't talk anymore. Alex is like fucking other men. So you're like, what's going on there? And it's all about how Kat begins to navigate city life while she is like not forced to dress as a boy, but like he makes her dress as a boy, and how she kind of likes it but also hates the attention it brings to her. And it was really interesting. I thought it dealt a lot with a lot of interesting topics like gender nonconformity, sexuality, marriage, the concept of honor and who gets to protect and defend and claim their own honor and the honor of others, and that was all just very interesting. I'm never gonna say this again, but I wanted more from the romance. It felt like the romance came way out of left field at the very end of the book, and it was with the character I was not expecting it to be with, but I actually ended up liking it. I liked their dynamic. They were very cute together, and I wish that we had gotten a little bit more of them. Like Swords Point, this book ends very abruptly, and unlike Swords Point, this has a coda/epilogue that takes place a few weeks after the main events of the story, but the coda is so vague about what the three main characters are doing and what their relationships to each other are now that it doesn't end up helping at all. Like, I feel thruple baited, and you cannot do that to me, Ellen Kushner. But yeah, overall I would say I like this. I also ended up really loving Alec and Richard's side plot that is kind of like in the background of this novel. When I opened it up and they were seemingly estranged and dating other people, I was like, what the hell happened in between books? But by the middle of the story, I was like, okay, Ellen Kushner, I should have never doubted you. Like, you have my back, okay? I trust you now. So I would recommend this one if you liked Swords Point, and if you want like more female characters, or if you're looking for a coming of age novel. I use this for the royalty bingo square, because Alec is the Duke and Kat becomes the Duchess at the end. They don't get married, by the way. That is kind of what that makes it sound like. No, he like abdicates and makes her the Duchess. He makes her his heir. Okay, so then I read The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. This was for my spring cleaning square because I put this book on my TBR forever ago, probably like when it came out in 2021, and just had never read it since. I just never got around to it. I am very much a fan of like the lesbians fighting colonialism genre, which is like what this book is in, and so I'm glad I finally got to read it. But I think because I have read very widely in this genre and other books like this, I kind of felt like this book was not as unique as it could be to other people, and so I didn't love it. I thought it was fine. I thought, again, it just didn't do enough to stand out in this genre of like lesbians fighting colonialism and falling in love, and I had some problems with the characters. I feel like this book is split pretty evenly between Terrain, who is like this soldier who was part of this group that were all kind of conscripted, kidnapped from colonized lands and put together in this army to serve like the empire. So Terrain is one of those, the Sands, and Luca is the princess of this nation that has colonized them. It's always going to be a hard sell to me for like colonizer, okay? It's just a hard sell. And in this story, Luca slip and slide so easily between like this very kind, benevolent, empathetic queen who like just wants to be better and like doesn't want to be a colonist, to like this evil dictator who like gladly crushes all these colonists under her boot and like will never give up the empire. Like, it is whiplash. It is a night and day. And then she all of a sudden just goes back again to being the nice, kind queen who, you know, doesn't want to do any of this. And it's like, what is happening? It kind of feels like Caitlin in season 2 of Arcane, where it's like she goes just far enough that you can't really like her anymore, but she's not complex or dark enough to feel like her descent into madness or descent into tyranny is interesting. And then she just goes back to being like a nice girl who needs a girlfriend, with barely any consequence and barely any like actual exploration into what that did to her and to her relationship. So, and Luca is meant to be 28, apparently. I was very surprised when I read that because she acts like a 17-year-old, and I feel like her mistakes and the way she is so easily influenced by other people into doing horrible shit would have been a lot more acceptable if she was like young and naive and unexperienced, but she's supposed to be 28 and very smart. So I was not down for that. And Terrain is a much more interesting and likable character as someone who like has been raised from birth in this nation but can never feel like she's really a part of it, and like kind of wants to know her homelands and her people and her birth family, but also can't, like, doesn't want to abandon the other people she was raised with and, you know, leave them out to dry. But Terrain also feels very inconsistent in her motivations and what she wants to do. She ping-pongs between various social movements and loyalties throughout the course of the story without it ever feeling like she has truly sided with them or learned to believe in them or care about the people in those movements. Like, she does some stupid, crazy shit that no one reacts to. Like, I thought her, spoilers, betraying the rebels was going to be a really big deal, and like it ends up emotionally mattering to Luca, but to the rebels themselves, they kind of don't give a fuck. And that was surprising to me. There's not enough time spent on like the cognitive dissonance between why Terrain is going so hard for the Sands and cares more about them than anything in the world when they seem like they don't like her and like are willing to turn on her at the drop of a hat. And I think you could make that interesting, like Terrain having this loyalty to what she feels like are her people and none of them care about her at all. But that dichotomy is never explored. Like, it's just treated like the Sands are this big family and Terrain would do anything for them when their actions in the story suggest otherwise. So there's also that. And for a story that is otherwise such a one-to-one fantasy recreation of like real-world colonialism, like, it was weird to me that the colonizers don't have religion. Like, that's gonna be a bigger deal later in the series, I think, but in this book it's like they're not religious at all, and they like look down on all the other places because they have religion and the religions are objectively real and give them power. And I think that's interesting, but also I feel like in the real world, Christianity was such a big justification and spreader of imperialism and colonialism that, like, I just think the story, the message and the theming around colonialism and imperialism loses a little bit when you just take that out and don't replace it with anything. Like, I think you could have portrayed Luca's people as like worshipping science instead and like using that as their like civilizing mission, but instead of it being this like, again, civilizing mission to bring science and innovation to the barbarians or whatever, it's very much treated as like an economic thing. Like, no, we need the colonies because we need their raw resources, we need them for our economy. So okay, I'm done yapping about that now. I would continue on with the series. I just don't know if it's a high priority because I would like to see where she goes with Terrain and Luca's relationship, because I just don't know how they get from where they are at the end of The Unbroken to like where they seem to be in the synopsis of book 2. I'm just like, how did we get there? And I would be interested to learn more about the religion in book 2, the magic in book 2. And I have a friend who's read both of them, and she thought the second book was much better than the first. So we'll see. The third book comes out in like October or November or something, so I might read the second book then. And then I read The Black Godstrums by P. Jelly Clark. I looked up how to pronounce this on his website, and thank you, sir, he has it listed on his website. This is a novella about this like alternate history version of New Orleans that kind of like, it's an alternate history version of the United States where the North and the South never reunited, but New Orleans is like this independent port that has a lot of free people of color in it. And there's airships and like magic and stuff like that. I thought this was a really interesting world and a very fun action-adventure romp, and I really liked the main character. And yeah, I just really enjoyed this one. It was very short and very fun, very action-packed, and I really liked the writing style, so I am definitely interested in picking up Master of Jinn now. The only reason why I didn't was because it was being repaired at the library, and I was gluing that thing back together with my own 2 hands. So I used that for the color imagery, what is it called? Colorful title bingo square. And then I read Among the Bros, a fraternity crime story by Max Marshall. This was one of the nonfiction books I read this month. This is a story about like this fraternity drug ring and how they got caught. This was an interesting read, although at a certain point, like, the operation just gets to be so large and making so much money that you know they're gonna get caught. Like, there's just no way they're getting away with it. Honestly, the most interesting thing about this story was how you could tell the author had clearly formed this like extremely parasocial relationship with one of the perpetrators involved. That was interesting to me, like to the point where they're like texting on an illegal burner phone while the guy's in jail. So, and he seemingly made no effort to actually verify that this guy on the phone he was texting was who he actually thought he was talking to. So I'm just like, bro, you're a journalist. How did you not like try to at least go see him in person to verify that is the guy you're talking to? But that was interesting. That was the most interesting part to me, because it did feel like the author, who was a white frat boy, was very invested in the culture and was like was mentioning like the horrific legacy of racism in these fraternities, but almost in a brushed off way, and then, you know, makes a bunch of these interjections where he's like, you know, I experienced the same thing as a frat boy, where he's like, I asked all my former frat brothers like what they thought about this, and they agreed. So maybe not the right person to tell this story and to tackle the topic of fraternities. It was just a little bit too positive and nostalgic. Although I did find interesting how he mentioned that the reason why fraternity bros are so willing to go through with like the horrible hazing that pledges are subjected to, and why they like never complain about it, and why they look back on that time period with fondness, is because for a lot of these men, that will be the only time in their lives that they are submissive to another person in general, because there are like these very rich white Southern men who will go on to be in positions of power in society. So like it's like a fun thing for them because they don't actually have to live that every day of their lives. I found that to be really interesting, and I would love a whole like psychological study on submission in fraternities. That sounds like a kink thing, but I would love to see it. And then I read When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, who wrote the Divergent series. I actually read her Carve the Mark, which was like her follow-up. I think it was like a YA story, but I never read the sequel. And I have literally zero recollection of anything that goes on in the story. I think they self-harm or something, but I can't really complain about that because I loved the Ugly series by Scott Westerfield, where there's also a lot of self-harm going on in like a look how cool they are type of way, so I can't say anything about that. But I don't remember anything about Carve the Mark. So when I saw this novella in the library, I was like, might as well pick it up, and I was actually very surprised, very pleasantly surprised by this novella. I thought it was a very fun time. It is like a urban fantasy set in Chicago about like monster hunters and the monsters who live in the city, very shadow hunters, but I felt like Veronica Roth had kind of a fun take on it because it's very heavily inspired by Polish mythology, so it had like a unique flavor to it. And I was very pleasantly surprised by the fact that the male and female lead are not in a romance in this book. It ends up kind of being a brother-sister kind of relationship, and the male lead kisses another guy instead. Yes, guys, it is gay. Don't know why it doesn't have the LGBT tag on Storygraph, because there is a gay kiss in this novella, and I was gagged. I was surprised. I was like, oh, thank you for that. So I did really enjoy this, and I would be interested. I saw there's a sequel coming out in September. Why are there good books coming out in September? So I would be interested to read that. My one critique is that, a couple critiques, it wasn't perfect. I felt like there were a couple characters that were kind of superfluous. The main character, Dimitri's sister, kind of is mentioned, but then it really never feels like we pay that off. And then the like core of this story for a long time is like the mystery of who Dimitri actually is and what he's doing in Chicago looking for Baba Yaga, but I felt like it was very obvious from the get-go like who he was and what he was doing, so the fact that it was treated as like this big twist reveal at the end wasn't really working for me, and I felt like it would have been a lot more interesting to kind of have us know that information from the very beginning, tell us that information at the start of the book, and then deal a lot more with him struggling to hide his identity from the other two characters. Don't remember their names at all, I'm very sorry. I felt like it would have been more interesting to focus on him trying to hide his identity from them and have the audience know who he is and feel that tension of him knowing that they would hate him if they knew, rather than having it be a secret from the audience as well and having it be this big reveal at the end and focusing more on their like shock and surprise, because like it's obvious, it's pretty obvious. Anyways, I didn't use that for a bingo square because it didn't fit anywhere for me. Anyways, so that was just for fun. I just enjoyed that one. Then I read The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia A. McKillip. This is a story about a very fairy tale lyrical type of story about a 16-year-old girl who is like all alone on this mountain with all these magical beasts that she controls. And one day this man comes by and is like, take this baby and raise it, please. You are its only surviving family after this like war has happened down in the lands of men. And she's like, okay, whatever. And so she takes this baby and she raises it along with the help of this like old witch woman who lives down the road on the mountain. And then 12 years later, when the baby is kind of grown up, he starts to want to know who his father is, and the father is like this king who got into a war with the guy who brought the girl the baby. I don't know, it's kind of complicated. Anyways, he goes off with the king to learn about his father, and meanwhile the guy who brought her the baby comes back up and is like, hey, what's up, like why did you let him go with that guy, like we're gonna start a war again. And they end up falling in love, Sybil and the guy Coral. Is that his name? I think so. They end up falling in love, but Sybil is very like, I can't you know, I don't want to go down into the world of men. I want to stay on my mountain with my dragon and boar and chill. But the king is kind of like scared by the fact that she has been spending time and she's on good terms with this other family who tried to like rebel against him in the past. So he sends a more powerful wizard to kidnap Sybil and like basically strip her will from her, and like he attempts to assault her. And then when Sybil is like manages to free herself with the help of some of her creatures, she is like so consumed by revenge and rage at like the king trying to do this to her that she hatches this revenge plot that involves marrying the guy that the king hates and like causing him to become so paranoid, and then leading the kingdom in an uprising against him until he has literally nothing. And it's really all about the cost of revenge and about trauma and how that shapes us into different people. And I found all that stuff to be really interesting. I feel like at the beginning of this book, I did not really like it. I was like, why is this 16-year-old raising a baby? And why is she gonna fall in love with the much older man who brought her the baby? Like, this is just lame. But the further into it I got, the more the writing style really like lulled me into it and got me into this, again, very fairy tale, allegorical, lyrical style, and just got me willing to accept what was happening and not think so hard about it. And I ended up really enjoying this story and what it said about love and revenge and the cost of violence to yourself. So that was interesting. I did like it. I used this for the dragon square because there is a dragon in this book. Then I read Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan M. Metzl. This is a book about why rural, poor Trump supporters continue to vote for policies that they know will actively harm them, like people with health conditions voting to decrease healthcare. And unsurprisingly, the answer is often racism. This book deals with like three main issues with gun violence, healthcare, and school funding. And I thought all three of those things were really interesting, and the ways that people convince themselves that they are the sacrifice, they are putting their bodies and their children on the line to protect other people from like wokeness or whatever, was very interesting and very, prescient when this book was published in 2019, but even more so now. There's a section in the school funding section that talks about austerity fever, austerity policies, where it's all about trying to cut as much money from the budget as possible, even while like everything else falls down around you, even when you didn't need to do that in the first place, when everything was running fine, there was no big like spending problem. And that just reminded me a lot of what Elon Musk is doing right now. So again, very prescient story, and I really enjoyed it. Not enjoyed, but I felt very informed by it, and I would like to see someone come up with some sort of solution for like what we can do about this like brainwashing and this mindset, and like how we can stop people from getting so far into that mindset that they can't be dragged out. But that's not really the scope of this book, so I would love to see more research done on this. And then I read Jade War, which is the second book in the Greenbone saga. I think I enjoyed this one a little bit more just because Andon, who is my favorite character, had a lot more to do. He got to go to Espinia and do all this stuff and do some gay shit, and I very much liked that. I also thought the pacing of this one was a little bit better. The pacing in the first one, it felt like we were going up and down and up and down and up and down, and then just at the 70% mark just releases, and it was a lot of falling action, whereas this one felt a lot more like slowly ramping up the tension until it snapped at the very end, and I enjoyed that. Although in this book it started to become quite apparent that Fonda Lee loves to get her female characters pregnant, and I'm not about that. I'm sorry, that's just like a squick for me personally. I'm not saying it's problematic or like call out for Fonda Lee, but I don't love it. But yeah, and also in this book I'm starting to get really tired of Barrow. I know that his like role in the story is to be this like chaos agent who is the luck element of the story, but that just makes him kind of boring because you know that he's just gonna fail upward no matter what happens. And also at the end of the story he gets involved with like communist revolutionaries. I'm like, what is going on here? He's not likable enough to care about, and he's not complex enough and smart enough to root for anyways. Like, it's just, I just don't care about him. I don't care about his chapters, which is sad because I feel like he could be very interesting, but he's not. And then I have The River Has Roots by Amal El-Moutar, which is the only book I have physically this month. So I'm one of like the 10 people on planet Earth who didn't really like This Is How You Lose the Time War, which this author co-wrote with Max Gladstone. I don't like This Is How You Lose the Time War because of the prose style mainly. I found it to be just overblown, known purple prose hater, like it was just a lot for me. And then I'm also not a very romance heavy person, and like the entire plot of that story is about romance, and you have to really be invested in the enemies to lovers, but also insta-lovey romance entirely through letters of these two characters, and I just didn't really buy it or care about them. So there was that, but I did want to try this one out because I thought it might be a lot more my speed. And yeah, I ended up actually really liking this. It is just as flowery as Time War, but I felt like it suited this book so much more because this book is this novella is deeply about language and about poetry and songs, and so I felt like that it fit. I didn't really care that the prose was very lyrical and poetic in this book because it fit the kind of narrative and vibe the story was going for. It very much feels like a Brothers Grimm fairy tale where everything is very lyrical and beautiful and long-winded, and I really liked what Amal Motar did with grammar and with sentence structure and word structure. I've heard the audiobook of this is also fantastic because the author and her sister sing and perform the songs. So this is a lovely little Brothers Grimm fairy tale about two girls who live at like the border of Fairy, and one of them is courting this suitor from Fairy, but also dealing with like this kind of unwanted human suitor, and stuff happens, and it's about the romance between Esther and Rin, who is like the non-binary fae love interest, but also about the sisterhood between Isabel and Esther, and I really enjoyed that. I loved seeing that dynamic. Very fun. Two things. I wish we had gotten more of Isabel's perspective sooner. We get some chapters kind of from her perspective in the latter half of the book, but it's mostly moving the plot along, whereas we don't really get to see a lot of her emotions, especially early on in the book, so that can kind of make her feel a little underdeveloped in comparison to Esther, who we spend the most time with, and it kind of makes it hard to not care about her, but it makes her seem very, in comparison, like you can see that Esther in her chapters deeply loves and cares about Isabel, that she is giving up so much for her and that she would do anything for her, and we don't see Isabel's perspective, so we just see her being kind of like ungrateful and whiny about it. And I'm not saying she is ungrateful and whiny, but like, and not saying I hate her or anything, but that's just kind of like how she comes across. And I found Rin and Esther to be a lot more interesting and a lot more well developed because they have a lot more page time and a lot more time spent to developing that relationship between them, whereas Isabel and Esther, not so much. They were always saying that they loved each other so much and were, you know, true sisters, but I never really felt that. And this is a book that's supposed to be so much more about sisterhood than about romantic love, but I just didn't really feel that. But again, I think it's done well enough for a novella, and it's just a really fun time. It's also a beautiful book. There's like woodcut illustrations that I really love, and again, it feels very Brothers Grimm-esque the way the story ends. I really liked it. And then there is also a teaser at the end of this book for Amal Motar's short story fairy tale collection, which I was very intrigued by, and I really liked the story previewed there, so I'll be picking that up. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? I used this for the Sisterhood Square on the book bingo. Surprise, surprise. I read The Hands of the Emperor by Victoria Goddard. This is a really long self-published book about the secretary of the emperor in this like fantasy sci-fi world who convinces the emperor to go on a vacation for the first time in forever, basically, and how that kind of ends up destroying the government in a very fun way. I felt like this book kind of like perfectly combined the personal and the political for me. It's a lot about people and about character development, about the main character and the emperor, but it's also a lot about politics and the government, and kind of the central theme of this story is like, if you had 1,000 years to slowly reform the government, could you do so? Could you invent communism in a fantasy world? And Victoria Goddard thinks yes, and I think so too. She convinced me. I don't think this kind of very slow incrementalism could ever like actually happen in real life because we are not immortal, but I was convinced by it in this book. And I also really liked the dynamic between the emperor and Kip. It's like this very, very loving relationship, but like they're so on such different planes of existence and such different social standings that it's kind of impossible for them to be true friends, and like the way in which they both try to kind of equalize themselves so that they can be true friends was really interesting to me. It got a little yaoi-ful. I did think it was slightly too long. The fourth and fifth sections were just a lot of Kip giving speeches to his family and to his friends and to his enemies, and like getting all self-righteously angry and then being immediately disproven of why he shouldn't feel that way, or like giving epic clapbacks to his enemies finally, and it was just a little much. It was very much a lot of and then everybody clapped speeches, but the kind of emotional payoff at the end of this novel is great. I was reading it till like 2 in the morning and I was crying like a little baby. It's great, very fun. I did start reading the sequel, so I've seen this compared a lot to The Goblin Emperor by Victoria by Catherine Addison, and I do agree. And I also would weirdly compare it to The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, and how it is kind of science fantasy. It took me like 500 pages to realize that the other worlds were other planets, maybe, I'm still not sure. The way in which you're kind of just thrown into this world and kind of expected to sink or swim. I always love that type of world building. So Goblin Emperor x Book of the New Sun, basically. Then I read Knight's Master by Tanith Lee. I've always wanted to get into Tanith Lee. She comes very highly praised by people who like a lot of the same female sci-fi authors I like. I've read one of her short stories in the Jeff and Anne Vandermeer's feminist speculative fiction anthology. I wasn't super wowed by it. It was just kind of a basic swords and sorcery type of short story just with a woman. But this book I really loved. I thought this was great. It felt very Anne Rice to me, very dark and beautiful and poetic in its tone, with this kind of brat prince main character who is super evil but like does one good thing when it counts, maybe for selfish reasons, but like we'll give it to him. I thought the prose in this was really beautiful as well, so I do want to continue on with this series and reading more Tanith Lee in general because I thought this was beautiful. Then I read The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nevo. This is a Great Gatsby retelling. I would call it more of a retooling, told from the perspective of Jordan Baker, who in this story is a queer Vietnamese adoptee, and she also has this like Vietnamese paper cutting magic where she can cut paper and make it come to life. I thought this was really interesting, and this is coming from the perspective of someone who actually, yeah, sue me, really likes the original Great Gatsby. It was one of the first classics I read in high school, and so I have this like nostalgic attachment to it, and I thought this was a great reimagining, great retelling. It has a bit of urban fantasy magical realism to it, and the focusing on Jordan Baker in particular and making her queer and Vietnamese, I think really added something really interesting to the story and to our character in specific. I feel like Jordan Baker is such an interesting yet slightly undercooked character in the original Great Gatsby. She kind of just exists to be Nick's love interest, but I really loved what Nevo did with her, and the making her queer and Vietnamese doesn't just feel like this tokenism that's been added in, which I was kind of afraid it would. It feels very real and very well researched and very well developed. Like Jordan coming to realize at the end of the story that she's always avoided Chinatown because alone, like she's this exotic beauty and fun little treat for the white people around her, but in the presence of other Asians, she's like this dangerous foreign threat, was so interesting, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. And I was surprised by how Nevo is able to like have her cake and eat it too by somehow including like every type of Gatsby relationship configuration possible in the story, every kind of canon relationship in the story, and every kind of like fanship in the story without it feeling like fan service. Like all of the relationships portrayed felt very real and very interesting and very much different things. And I think I've never read another Great Gatsby retelling, but I did read a lot of Gatsby fan fiction on AO3 in high school. Yes, I was the kind of high schooler who read Gatsby fanfiction. But in those, I feel like Jordan Baker is a character that people just aren't sure what to do with her. They kind of either relegate her to the edges of the story, being Nick's beard, being in a Pair the Sparrows relationship with Daisy, which I love. I love Daisy and Jordan. That was my ship as a teenager. But they don't actually care about that relationship and like developing that and exploring what that would be like. They just are kind of trying to get them off to the side so that Nick and Gatsby can bang. Like, and I'm in support of that as well, but to see a story center her and like give her so much depth and so much feeling, I thought was really great. And I see some criticism of the story saying that the magic like could have been cut out and nothing could be changed. I don't agree with that. The magic is very important to this story, the paper cutting in particular, and there are a couple of big changes to the original Gatsby that I really loved, that utilized the paper magic, and I wish there had been more of that. I wish she had gone further with that, because it feels like in the second half of this book, Nevo can't really decide how far she wants to move from the original Great Gatsby, whether she wants to make it a story all about Jordan and her reclaiming her identity and have her have nothing to do with like Gatsby getting murdered, or if she wants to very closely and faithfully follow the original story and just involve Jordan more deeply in it. And so she kind of ends up trying to do both, and it ends up being a little bit dissatisfying on both of those counts. So I enjoyed the first half of the novel a bit more than the second half. It felt a little bit rushed at the ending and also emotionally not super wrapped up, but I really loved what happened with Nick and Jordan at the end. And I also have, try not to dox myself, I have the companion novel because the bookstore of my house was closing so it could move, and I saw this and I bought it. and then I had to read the original one. But I'm glad because I ended up really liking it, again, coming from the perspective of someone who really likes the original Great Gatsby. And I don't know how this would hit for you if you've never read it, but I see differing opinions, whether people saying they really loved it, people saying they didn't get it at all. So I did really like this, and I'm currently reading Siren Queen by Nevo because I liked it so much. So, and then I read The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a story told from 3 framing narratives from the perspective of a 30-year-old grad student who has just come into possession of her great-great-great-grandfather's journal. He was a Lutheran priest who was writing down the confession story of this Blackfeet man named Goodstab who was turned into a vampire and spent a very long time hunting down buffalo hunters, as well as the vampire who turned him into a vampire. And so each of those is told in a first-person narrative through slightly different ways. Etsy is her name, the grad student typing it up on her laptop, the Lutheran priest, Arthur, writing it in his journal, and Goodstab saying it to Arthur. 2 of the framing narratives I didn't really love. I didn't really love Etsy's voice. It felt very T. Kingfisher, House with Good Bones to me, where it's quirky millennial, very chatty, very humorous. And it's doing this thing where it's like trying to act like the story is happening in real time, and she's writing it down as it's happening in real time by like having her laptop die and she has to go get a phone cord, or like having her, you know, type as if she's being chased or whatever. It's like, the more attention you draw to the fact that this is like a narrative that couldn't happen in real time, the more obvious it becomes. So I didn't love Etsy, and I just don't think she had enough personal stakes in this story. Like, she wants to make the journal into a book and publish it so that she can stay in academia, but we just don't get enough time with her to actually care about that being her goal and about her succeeding. And then the Lutheran priest, his writing style is the opposite. It's very long-winded and very formal and very dry, and he goes off on these long tangents about the food that his parish has brought him. Like, whose idea was it to start this book with like a 4-page diatribe about blackberry jam? I'm sorry, but I almost stopped reading. It was so boring. But once we get to Goodstab's narrative, I absolutely loved it. I ate up Goodstab's narrative. I thought he was so interesting and his story was so cool, and just what it has to say about revenge and what makes a monster versus what makes a hero, and America's founding and colonial history, like, was just so good. I loved that, and Goodstab's narrative is like the majority of the narrative. So I would say I like this overall. But yeah, I didn't really like Etsy and Arthur, and I also think that Arthur is just not likable enough to care about like the kind of twist that happens. But he, like, I don't know, like the Schadenfreude, like, it's not just like, you're not just happy to see him suffer either, because kind of the end of the story wants you to feel bad for him. Like, I just don't know. Arthur and Etsy didn't do it for me, but I loved Goodstab, so I would still recommend this. I've never read any Stephen Graham Jones before, so I don't know how this would hit for you if you are a really big fan of his, but I still do want to read, what is it called? The Indian Lake Trilogy, because I liked this. I liked this. I read Exit Strategy by Martha Wells for the humorous fantasy sci-fi on the board. I have gone on record in the past saying that I am a big Martha Wells fan. I love her fantasy, but I'm not the hugest Murderbot fan, and I stand by that. I think Murderbot is good. It's just not really my type of sci-fi. But Exit Strategy was by far my favorite book in the series so far. I actually really enjoyed it, and I think that's because this one kind of finishes out like an overarching plot that has been finally building over the course of the books, and we meet up with the characters from the first novella, and actually get to see how much Murderbot has grown, and like actually get it to acknowledge that it does like have feelings and have wants, and see how far it's come from that first book and how they react to it now. And so I thought that was really great, and that was really fun to see. So I had felt no great desire to continue on with the series, but honestly I think I will now. Like, I think I might as well just finish it out. Might as well, while I'm waiting for Queen Demon. So I enjoyed that. And then I read Guards by Terry Pratchett. This is my first Discworld. I was really hesitant to read this because I'm not a huge fan of like very quirky British fantasy. I'm not really a huge fan of Douglas Adams either, but I wanted to give this a try, and I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. I found it, the humor, it didn't overdo the humor, and I found it to be actually a very profound story about like cities and power and morality. I still didn't love it. I thought the kind of romance was really annoying because it was like, it was treated as like, oh, you know, they both could do better, but they also can't, so they might as well date. When like Sam Vimes' problems with that, he was like this horrible, unlikable alcoholic do-nothing, whereas Sybil Ramkin's problems was that she was fat. Like, that was literally it. So didn't love that. And also, like, there's a faint hint of propaganda to this story, and I just don't like that. I never like reading about cops, I'm sorry. But I would like to read more Discworld. I heard the witches stories are really fun, so I want to read those as well. So I'm not totally writing this off. Okay, we're finally done with everything I read in April, 22 books. I would love to know your opinions. Have you read any of these books and what did you think? I have finished the 9 main squares for the Female Gaze Summer Reading Challenge. So I told myself I was gonna take a break and focus on fantasy bingo, or, you know, just read some other stuff besides fantasy for a little bit. And I have not been doing that. I've been continuing to read for the bingo because I'm just so close to being done. Like, I just want to, not that I want to get it done, but like my brain is like, I have to finish it. I have to finish it. But that has been fun, and I would love to have, you know, some more recommendations. If you think anything could fit a square that I haven't filled yet, that would be fun. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.